The memory of that courtroom never left me. The polished oak benches, the musty smell of legal books stacked high, the hum of whispered voices as though the whole town leaned in to listen to my destruction. I remember standing in that suffocating silence, my heart beating so violently against my ribs I thought it would break through my chest. My little girl, my Emily, sat 2 rows behind me, her tiny hands clutching the stuffed rabbit I'd given her when she was 3. She was 6 then, old enough to know fear, too young to understand the machinery of power grinding her father into dust. The judge's gavel came down like a guillotine. His words were sharp, measured, cruel in their calmness. Custody is hereby transferred to the state. The father is deemed unfit. Unfit. That word shredded me. I'd worked 2 jobs, kept food on the table, read her bedtime stories even when my eyes burned from exhaustion. I wasn't perfect, but I was hers, and she was mine. Yet, in that moment, one man's word turned me into a stranger in her life. It didn't take long for whispers to reach me. A neighbor who knew someone in the foster system, a lawyer who'd been too afraid to fight harder in my defense. Each piece hinted at something darker than my supposed unfitness. There was talk of quotas, of money exchanging hands, of children shuffled like cards in a rigged deck. I wanted to scream, to storm into the judge's chambers, to drag him from behind that robe and demand my child back. But I had nothing but a broken heart and a system that branded me a failure. The years that followed were a blur of hollow days and haunted nights. I worked, I drank, I stared at photographs of Emily until the edges of the paper curled from my grip. I heard rumors that she was moved from one foster home to another, that her smile dimmed a little more each time. And with every whisper, a seed of rage grew in me. Rage at the man who had smiled when he signed my child away. Rage at the polished machinery that masked itself as justice. Rage at myself for being powerless. But rage has a way of becoming something else when it festers. It becomes patient. It watches. It waits. And one night, nearly a decade later, when I was standing outside a crumbling bar and nursing the weight of another sleepless night, I overheard 2 men talking. They weren't careful with their words, drunk, laughing about easy money. One of them dropped a name, the same foster agency that had taken care of Emily. The other spoke of children like merchandise, of payoffs hidden under legal jargon, of judges who ensured the flow never stopped. I didn't breathe. My hands clenched until my knuckles turned white. My suspicions, my torment, my broken years, they weren't delusions. They were truth. Ugly, rotten truth. That was the night I decided to become something I'd never been before. Not just a father who lost, not just a man who mourned, but a shadow, a seeker, a patient hunter. The years of waiting had taught me silence, endurance, the art of being invisible. I began digging. Public records, property deeds, tax filings. I followed breadcrumbs hidden in plain sight, nonprofits with impossible expenses, judges with inexplicable real estate, agencies drowning in donations that smelled of laundered money. I learned to smile while I copied documents, to nod while I slid into back rooms with a recorder in my pocket. Every night I stacked papers, names, dates, proof, like bricks in a wall I was building around them, a cage. But it wasn't enough to expose numbers. I needed a face, a voice, a moment that would tear their mask apart. I needed someone inside. And then, as though fate itself leaned toward me, I found her. Maya. She'd worked at the foster agency years ago. She was older now, tired, carrying secrets in her eyes. When I first approached her, she tried to brush me off, said she couldn't risk it, that powerful men had ruined people for far less. But when I told her my name, when I told her I was Emily's father,
She froze. She knew my daughter. She had seen the way the system moved her like a pawn, and she had stories. So many stories.
We met in quiet diners, in the corners of libraries, in my rusted truck parked under bridges. She told me about cash-filled envelopes, about judges who smiled at Christmas galas hosted by agency directors, about children placed, not for safety, but for profit. She gave me files she'd hidden, terrified of what they could mean if discovered. With every word, every page, the fire in me blazed hotter. But fire alone couldn't bring down men who had built fortresses of power. I needed precision. I needed to set the stage. And so I bided my time, weaving the threads tighter. It was during one of those nights of careful planning that I saw her again. Emily. She was 17 now, taller, her face sharper, but her eyes were the same. She was walking out of a foster home, her shoulders hunched as though carrying invisible weight. I didn't approach her. I couldn't. Not yet. If they saw me, if they suspected, everything would unravel. But I watched, my chest breaking open, as I realized she'd grown up without me, a stranger in her own father's story. That night, I swore an oath to the silence around me. Not only would I bring them down, not only would I tear the judge's mask from his face, but I would make sure Emily saw who I truly was. Not the man they told her was unfit, but the man who fought the impossible for her. The day finally came when I walked back into that same courthouse. I wasn't the broken man of years ago. My shoulders were squared, my evidence stacked like daggers in my briefcase. And as I stood at the threshold, I saw him, the judge. Older, heavier, his arrogance wrapped around him like a second robe. He didn't recognize me at first. Why would he? I had been just another name on his docket, another life signed away. But he would remember me soon enough, because this time I wasn't leaving without cutting the rot out of his empire. When his eyes landed on me, a flicker of recognition broke through the practiced mask of indifference. The faint twitch at the corner of his mouth betrayed him. He remembered. The unfit father, the man he had crushed beneath his gavel without a second thought. His glance slipped away quickly, but I had already seen it, the crack in his armor. I didn't come to plead this time. I came armed with truth sharper than any blade. Maya had agreed to testify. I had recordings, documents, bank transfers, enough to bury him and the agency that fed off broken families like mine. But I knew men like him. They didn't die quietly. They clawed, they twisted, they summoned allies from shadows. So I had to be careful, patient, strategic. I started small, leaks to local reporters. Anonymous packages slid under office doors. A handful of records showing inflated expenses, unexplained bonuses. I watched the first ripples form. Journalists asking questions, whispers in the courthouse corridors, judges and directors casting nervous glances at one another. Then came the strike. I arranged for a meeting. Not with him, but with the state's Internal Affairs Division. I walked into that sterile office with my briefcase, laid out the evidence, and for the first time in years spoke without hesitation. Dates, names, payments, transfers. Maya sat beside me, her voice steady as she recounted how they'd shuffled children for profit. She didn't cry. She was past tears. So was I. The investigators listened, some skeptical, some leaning forward with the sharp hunger of men who smelled blood.
By the time we left, the machine had started to move. Slowly, carefully, but it moved. The judge must have felt it. He summoned me. Not officially. He was too clever for that. A message slipped to me through a friend. A private meeting, away from the courthouse, to talk things through. I considered not going, but my rage demanded I see him, face to face. We met in the back room of a country club he thought was untouchable ground. He was waiting, his robe shed for an expensive suit, a drink in his hand like none of this was out of the ordinary. He greeted me with that oily smile, as though he were a benevolent king meeting a subject.
"You've made a mistake," he said, voice smooth as poison. "You're chasing shadows. Whatever lies that woman told you, you'll find yourself ruined if you pursue them." I didn't sit. I leaned forward, inches from him, and whispered words I had waited years to speak. "You took my daughter, and I'm taking everything from you." For the first time, his smile faltered. The weeks that followed unfolded like a storm gathering strength. Subpoenas were issued. Investigators seized records from the foster agency. Journalists swarmed the courthouse steps. His name, once spoken with reverence, was now dragged through mud in headlines. Corruption allegations, children for profit scheme, judge under fire. And still he fought. He used every trick, every ally, every ounce of influence to paint himself as the victim of a vendetta. He called me a bitter father, desperate for revenge. He smeared Maya as a disgruntled employee. He threw money at lawyers who twisted words until they screamed. But truth has a way of cutting through lies when it's sharp enough, and mine was a blade honed for years. The turning point came when we produced video recordings. Maya had risked everything to obtain them. In them, directors of the agency spoke casually about payments, about keeping certain judges happy, about ensuring children were placed in the right homes for donors. His voice wasn't on them, but his name was, mentioned, praised, protected. The day that video went public, his empire cracked wide open. And then came Emily. I hadn't planned for her to be part of this storm. I had hoped to shield her until the end, until the dust had settled. But she appeared, summoned by the weight of her own questions. She was nearly 18 now, sharp-eyed, weary from years of being passed around like luggage. She found me outside the courthouse one morning, her voice trembling but steady enough. "Are you really my dad?" The question crushed me. The years of silence, of distance, of lies they had fed her, it all stood between us like a wall. I nodded, my throat tight. "I never stopped being your dad. They just tried to erase me." Her eyes filled, but no tears fell. She'd grown too strong for that. I heard them talking, the families. They said kids were just money. Was it him? I didn't answer with words. I handed her the papers, the proof, the dagger that had once been my grief but was now my weapon. She read, her hands shook, and then she said the words that became the final push I needed. "Make him pay." The trial was brutal. Weeks of testimony, of defense attorneys clawing at every shred of evidence. But the weight of truth was too heavy. Witness after witness came forward, emboldened by Maya, by the journalists, by the noise that could no longer be silenced. And when the prosecution finally laid down the recordings, the bank transfers, the testimonies of children grown old enough to speak for themselves, the courtroom air turned heavy.
I sat there watching him sweat under the weight of everything he had built to bury others. The robe couldn't protect him. The arrogance couldn't shield him. His empire of lies crumbled stone by stone. The verdict came down with the same gavel he once used to destroy me. Only this time, it wasn't my life shattering. It was his. Guilty, corruption, racketeering, conspiracy. He didn't look at me as they led him away in chains. Perhaps he couldn't bear to, or perhaps he knew that if he did, he would see not just me, but every parent he had crushed, every child he had stolen. When it was over, Emily stood beside me. She didn't hug me, not yet. The years between us were too jagged to bridge so easily. But she slipped her hand into mine, tentative, but real. And that was enough. I had lost nearly a decade. I had walked through fire and shadows. I had become a hunter of men who thought themselves untouchable. And those scars remained, one truth blazed brighter than any wound. The judge who took my child away was gone, and I had returned, not just with proof, but with justice.